Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal as the summer night sky over Port Charles exploded with dazzling fireworks and echoed with joyous cheers, the celebratory spirit that swept through the city was abruptly shattered inside the quiet shadows of Michael and Sasha's boathouse. The vibrant pulse of festivity outside became a cruel contrast to the nightmare unfolding within. Sasha, with trembling hands and breath caught in her chest, stepped toward the crib where her daughter had been sleeping just moments before. Her eyes darted across the dimly lit nursery in a rising panic. The baby monitor stood ominously silent, its screen dark, its beeping absent. A cold gust of air drifted through the slightly ajar window, lifting the sheer curtain like a sinister hand waving goodbye. Her heart seized violently in her chest. The crib was empty. She let out a scream so primal it seemed to claw at the very walls, a mother's cry of desperation that tore through the boathouse like a siren. In her frenzy, Sasha stumbled out of the room, her voice raw from calling Daisy's name again and again, as if the act alone could summon her back. Michael heard the scream before his mind could register the sound. Adrenaline surged through him, and he tore down the hallway toward Sasha, grabbing her shoulders just as her knees threatened to buckle. He looked into her eyes, and the sheer terror staring back at him was more than enough. The word "missing" hit him like a lightning strike to the chest, knocking the air from his lungs and freezing his blood. Michael sprang into action. He raced through every room of the boathouse, flinging open doors, yanking back curtains, searching every shadowy corner and forgotten alcove. He dropped to his knees to check beneath furniture, behind storage bins, inside closets that had long remained untouched. But the silence was absolute. There were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no broken glass. The only thing left behind was the void, and it grew larger with every passing second. Sasha collapsed onto the nursery floor, clutching Daisy's baby blanket to her face, her body racked with convulsions of grief. Her sobs echoed off the walls, sharp and hollow, the sound of a woman unraveling. Then, unnoticed at first, a small figure appeared at the doorway. Wiley stood still, pale and visibly shaken, his stuffed animal clutched tight to his chest, his lips pressed into a trembling line. His shoulders slumped slightly under the invisible weight of what he had just witnessed. Though young, something in his eyes had changed, innocence bruised by the burden of a horrifying truth. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply watched, silently, as his parents dissolved into fear and anguish before his eyes. Michael, eventually aware of his son's presence, turned and froze. The look on Wiley's face stopped him cold. Kneeling slowly, he extended a hand, trying to anchor himself to the one thing that still made sense. Wiley stepped forward, hesitating, then began to speak in broken, faltering sentences. As Sasha's cries faded into background tremors, Wiley shared what he had seen. Earlier, as the city erupted in celebration and the sky lit up with brilliant streaks of color, Wiley had awakened from a nap. Drawn by an unfamiliar noise, he had tiptoed toward Daisy's room, the floorboards creaking under his small feet. From behind the slightly open door, he had seen something he could not fully understand, a tall man, dressed in a long brown coat, his face hidden beneath a black cap pulled low. The stranger stood over the crib with calculated movements, lifting Daisy into his arms. Wiley remembered the overwhelming scent of cigarettes, thick and acrid, burning into his memory. But what disturbed him most was the glint of silver swaying against the intruder's chest, a necklace with a pendant shaped like the letter S, shimmering in the dark like a warning. The weight of that single detail crashed down on Michael with devastating clarity. The pendant wasn't random. It was a mark, one he had encountered before. That particular symbol had once been associated with a covert syndicate, a network with deep, poisonous roots in Port Charles. It had long been suspected that Sidwell still maintained connections to such organizations, even if nothing had ever been proven. Now, with Daisy missing and Wiley as an inadvertent witness, everything pointed to a darker truth. The kidnapping was not an accident. It was not the act of a deranged lone wolf or a desperate thief. It was a message, a move in a strategic game orchestrated by forces far more insidious than Michael had previously imagined. Someone had been watching them. Someone had waited for the perfect moment to strike, knowing the exact hour they would be distracted. It had been deliberate, methodical, an operation executed with military precision. Michael rose to his feet with the slow, chilling resolve of a man who had been plunged into war. The panic inside him was rapidly calcifying into something harder, colder, a need for justice, for vengeance, for action. The safety of his children was no longer guaranteed, and that was an intolerable reality. He looked at Wiley, his son's face pale and strained, and realized that the boy had not only lost another piece of his innocence, but had also become the only key to unraveling the plot. Wiley had seen the face of the enemy. He had given them the only lead they had. But this lead came with danger. If the people who took Daisy discovered that a child had identified them, Wiley's life would be at risk. Michael knew what needed to be done. Wiley had to be hidden, protected, shielded from the very forces now tightening around their family like a noose. Sasha needed to be stabilized, watched closely so she wouldn't fall apart completely. And he had to become something more than just a father now. He had to become a hunter. Far from the boathouse, in an undisclosed location cloaked in shadows, the man in the brown coat stood before a crib. Daisy whimpered softly, her tiny arms waving in the air, her cries muffled by the silence of the room. The man looked down at her with no trace of emotion, lifting a phone to his ear and issuing a cold, mechanical update. On the other end, Sidwell listened with satisfaction, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. The child was leverage, a pawn in a much larger scheme to destabilize, to provoke, to force certain players out of hiding. And if it meant bringing Michael to his knees, all the better. But what Sidwell didn't know was that Wiley had spoken. A child's eyes had pierced the shadows. And even in his innocence, he had seen enough to ignite a war that would shake Port Charles to its core. Michael was no longer just a victim. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was a man on the edge, fueled by desperation, fury, and the knowledge that the ones he loved were being targeted. And when pushed too far, Michael would become something far more dangerous than any of them anticipated. The game had changed. The pieces were moving. And the war for Daisy had only just begun. While Sasha teetered on the brink of hysteria, her body convulsing in helpless sobs, her face ashen and streaked with tears, Michael remained grounded by sheer force of will. He could not afford to unravel. Not now. Not when every second counted. Instinctively, he pulled Wiley close, shielding his son's small body against his chest. He pressed a gentle kiss to the boy's forehead, his lips trembling against the warmth of Wiley's skin. In that brief, silent gesture, Michael transferred all the protection, love, and unspoken promises of a father desperate to safeguard his children from a world that had just turned monstrous. He did not speak loudly, nor did he allow panic to surface. His voice, calm but firm in its urgency, laid out the first critical step. Wiley must be taken away, far from this house of unraveling grief, and hidden where no shadow could reach him. Sasha, though nearly paralyzed by despair, heard him. He told her to take Wiley to Carly. Immediately. Discreetly. No one was to know that Wiley had seen anything, had recognized the intruder, had noticed the pendant with the glinting S. That knowledge was now as volatile as fire. If whoever orchestrated the kidnapping learned there was a witness, especially a child, Wiley's life would become the next bargaining chip. There would be no mercy. No hesitation. Michael knew the nature of the organization behind this, cold, efficient, and merciless. Wiley's survival now depended on silence. Though still visibly shaken, Sasha's vacant stare began to clear. Michael's sharp instructions cut through the fog of agony that clouded her. There was no time for paralysis. No room for collapse. Somewhere deep inside her, the maternal instinct that had protected her through loss and trauma before ignited once more. With her hands still trembling, she reached for Wiley, pulling him tightly against her chest. Her face remained stone-like, as though any expression might crack her in two, but her movements were precise. Determined. She wrapped Wiley in a blanket, checked the hallway for signs of movement, and without another word, stepped out into the night. Each step she took was heavy, deliberate, as though the weight of the missing child clung to her soul with every footfall. Her body moved, but her spirit remained fractured in the nursery she had just left behind. Michael stood frozen for a moment in the silence that followed. The absence of Daisy's cries had become deafening. The air in the boathouse was stifling, thick with the ghost of what had just happened. He turned back into the nursery, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The crib stood in the center of the room, still slightly rocking from earlier movement, now like a taunting reminder of failure. He stared at it, his hands clenched at his sides, the veins on his forearms taut beneath the skin. This space, once the sanctuary of his daughter, now felt like a mausoleum. He scanned the room methodically, his gaze honed with the clarity of purpose that came only in moments of total devastation. Then, near the window, his eyes caught something faint, an irregular smudge on the wooden floor, darker than the rest, a streak of wet mud that had no business being there. He dropped to one knee and examined it closely. A boot print. Large. Heavy. Masculine. The pressure pattern indicated someone who had stood still, probably watching before moving in. Michael pulled out his phone, snapped several photos of the print from multiple angles, and saved them in a locked folder. It was the only tangible clue he had. It was more than just mud. It was a breadcrumb, a trail that, if followed, might lead him into the heart of the monster's lair. Across town, miles from the chaos, in an undisclosed, dimly lit warehouse reeking of oil and dust, another crib sat in the center of a room with no windows. The lighting was minimal, just one bare bulb hanging above the child, casting a narrow pool of light that did nothing to warm the air. Daisy whimpered softly, her small fists flailing in protest, her face red and wet with frightened tears. She was alone in the physical sense, but someone was always watching. A man stood in the far corner, face obscured by shadows, his breath steady, his demeanor entirely unbothered by the infant's distress. His presence was menacing not because of overt violence but because of the total absence of empathy. He didn't move to comfort the child. He didn't check the temperature or adjust the blanket. Instead, he lifted a phone from his pocket and dialed a number that had been programmed long before tonight's events. The line connected without a ring. The voice that emerged was deep, mechanical in its brevity. The man delivered his message with clinical detachment. The package had arrived. That was all. On the other end of the line, Sidwell smiled. Not a wide grin, not the smug satisfaction of a villain revealed, but the slight curl of the lip that betrayed triumph layered in malice. He leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of multiple monitors illuminating his face. Everything had gone according to plan. The fireworks had been a perfect distraction. The infiltration, the extraction, the disappearance, flawless. Port Charles would soon spiral into a chaos of accusations and grief. And in the midst of that collapse, Sidwell would begin to pull the strings of influence he had quietly cultivated. Daisy wasn't just a baby. She was leverage. She was bait. And Michael, blinded by emotion, was expected to fall into the trap. But there was one variable Sidwell hadn't accounted for. One thread, fragile yet deadly, that now threatened to unravel everything. Wiley. A child he had dismissed as harmless. A toddler, barely able to articulate full sentences, had become the sole eyewitness to the operation. Sidwell had underestimated the boy. And now, unknowingly, he had created a new enemy, not just in Michael, but in the unseen momentum of truth moving through Wiley's memory. Back in the boathouse, Michael stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a peaceful night. The toys. The crib. The silence. His jaw tightened. He would not go to the police, not yet. He could not risk Daisy becoming another case file, another line of regret in an overwhelmed system. He would handle this his way. He would hunt. He would find. He would recover. The game was no longer passive. The enemy had taken his child, and now Michael had nothing left to lose. And everything to avenge. Michael returned to the living room, the silence of the house now a suffocating void pressing down on every wall, every object, every breath. The dim glow of the single table lamp barely illuminated the room as he walked past the toys scattered on the floor, Daisy's blanket still clutched in his hand like a piece of her soul torn away and left behind. He moved with rigid precision, his entire body pulsing with urgency, rage, and grief that had crystallized into singular purpose. Time was no longer on their side. Every second Daisy spent in the hands of whoever had taken her was another second of danger, another second of psychological warfare being waged against a child too young to even understand the stakes. He sat down heavily in front of the laptop and opened it, his fingers flying across the keyboard before the screen had fully powered on. The operating system booted into an encrypted shell, an off-the-grid communication network he had once co-designed during his secret collaboration with Sonny, long before he ever thought he'd need to return to it. That system, dormant for years, had been created for moments exactly like this. When the law couldn't be trusted, when enemies moved in shadows, and when justice had to be hunted with your own hands. Michael bypassed the traditional channels, diving straight into the subterranean network of encrypted nodes and message boards. There were no usernames here, no names at all, just a grid of digital ghosts. He searched for code tags, identifying markers, anything connected to the S symbol, the same pendant Wiley had described, the same insignia Michael had seen once in a dossier he was never supposed to read. He input keyword strings, cross-referenced metadata, time-stamped aliases that could be linked to shell accounts that once worked under Sidwell's umbrella of influence. He wasn't just looking for a name. He was looking for a pattern. And more than that, he was looking for evidence that the organization behind Daisy's abduction had never truly left Port Charles. He found pings. Small signals that traced back to burner devices still active within the city limits. A few had gone dark in recent weeks, likely abandoned in the wake of internal purges or rerouted operations. But 3 remained active, clustered in a region near the outskirts of the warehouse district. An area long rumored to host the logistics side of Port Charles's criminal undercurrent. One of those signals included a recent communication burst just minutes after the fireworks had begun. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. It had to be a status update. Proof that the operation had succeeded. Michael leaned back, rubbing his temples, his mind racing to piece together the implications. Someone in Port Charles was actively maintaining the infrastructure of a dormant syndicate that should have been dismantled years ago. Sidwell wasn't just reviving an old operation, he was expanding it, adapting it under the radar, using symbols and methods that only a few ever truly understood. And now that organization had taken his daughter. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was a move designed to destabilize him, to cripple his judgment, to force him into a vulnerable position where others could strike. But they had miscalculated. They had underestimated just how far Michael would go. He needed someone who could move in silence, someone with blood on their hands and no illusions about what justice required. There was only one man who could help him now, Jason. The one person who understood how the enemy operated, who didn't flinch in the face of death, who had saved Michael's life more times than he could count. Their bond was forged not just in family, but in violence, in shared secrets, in mutual survival. Michael typed a specific key sequence, triggering a prearranged beacon, a silent signal embedded into the old system that would alert Jason if Michael ever invoked it. It carried no words. No details. Just one message: I need you. There was no time for explanations. No time for fear. This wasn't about guilt or grief anymore. It was war. Outside, the city slumbered under the illusion of safety. Families drifted off to sleep, children tucked into bed, the final trails of smoke from the fireworks fading into the night sky. But beneath that peaceful veneer, a silent battle had already begun. A father with nothing left to lose was now hunting through the dark for the child who had been stolen from him. A mother was crumbling under the weight of both past trauma and present terror, walking the knife's edge between sanity and emotional ruin. And a small boy, the only one who had seen the face of the enemy, carried a truth within him that could shatter an entire network of lies. Port Charles would not be the same again. The cracks had already begun to appear in the city's foundation. And when the truth emerged, when names were exposed, when the blood trail led back to the elite and the protected, everything would burn. Daisy was more than a missing child. She was a spark. The catalyst. The matchstick pressed against decades of rot and darkness that had been buried beneath boardrooms, charity galas, and backroom deals. Her abduction was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And Michael, once the idealist who tried to play by the rules, was now prepared to tear the entire system apart brick by brick. Because he understood now. This was no longer about justice in the legal sense. This was survival. This was vengeance. This was the beginning of a war that would bring every shadow into the light. And for those who had taken Daisy, for those who thought they could use a child to manipulate a father, they would soon learn that monsters were not born in darkness. They were made in silence, forged in grief, and unleashed by loss.